It was on this day 6 years ago that he buried his 3-year-old daughter while police were beginning their relentless campaign to blame him for her murder.
Wilmington, Illinois. A small town of a few thousand people along Old Route 66, about 60 miles southwest of Chicago. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on, and where nothing bad is supposed to happen. On June 6, 2004, that changed forever. A 3-year-old girl named Riley Fox vanished from her living room while her father slept down the hall. By the end of that day, she would be found dead in a creek less than 4 miles from her home. What followed wasn't just a murder investigation. It was a case study in how quickly a grieving family can become suspects, how a false confession can be built in a police interrogation room, and how close a real killer came to walking free. This is the story of the Riley Fox case. Kevin and Melissa Fox were high school sweethearts who had grown up in Wilmington and settled down there to raise a family. By the summer of 2004, they had 2 children, 6-year-old Tyler and 3-year-old Riley, a bright-eyed toddler that everyone who knew her described as full of energy and mischief. That weekend, Melissa was in Chicago, taking part in a walk to raise money for breast cancer awareness. Kevin was home with the kids. On the night of June 5th into the early morning of June 6th, Kevin dropped the children off with their grandmother while he went out for the evening. He picked Tyler and Riley up around 1 in the morning. The children's beds weren't made up with clean sheets, so rather than wake them further by making the beds, Kevin laid Riley down on the living room couch and put Tyler in a nearby chair. He checked on them, then went to his own room. By his account, he was asleep by around 2:30 in the morning. The next thing he remembers is Tyler waking him just before 8 a.m., telling him that Riley was gone. Kevin searched the house. He searched the yard. He checked with neighbors. After about 40 minutes with no sign of his daughter, he called the police. Within hours, most of Wilmington was out searching. It was the kind of town where a missing child brought the whole community into the street. Melissa rushed back from Chicago the moment she heard. The search didn't take long to end, but not the way anyone hoped. Later that same day, Riley's body was found in Forked Creek, near the Forsyth Woods Forest Preserve, a public park a few miles from the Fox home. She was face down in the water. She had been bound, gagged with duct tape, sexually assaulted, and drowned. A 3-year-old girl, taken from her own living room in the middle of the night, killed within walking distance of her house. In the days that followed, Will County investigators, led by Detective Scott Swearingen, began building a theory of the crime. Publicly, they told the Fox family they were exploring several angles, including the idea that someone with a grudge against Kevin or Melissa might be responsible. Privately, according to later court filings, the lead detective suspected almost immediately that Riley's death might have been made to look like an abduction murder by someone close to her. In other words, someone in the household. Kevin and Melissa cooperated fully. They gave fingerprints. They gave DNA samples. They answered questions again and again. There was no reason, in their minds, not to. They wanted their daughter's killer found. For 5 months, the case remained unsolved in the public eye, an active, painful mystery for a small town that couldn't stop grieving. Reporters from Chicago made regular trips down Route 53 to Wilmington. Vigils were held. Flyers stayed taped to storefront windows long after the initial search had ended. Behind the scenes, though, the investigation had already narrowed its focus in a way the public didn't know about. Court records from the Fox's later civil suit allege that investigators grew fixated on inconsistencies in the timeline. Kevin gave small details about when exactly he fell asleep, how deeply, and whether he could plausibly have failed to hear an intruder enter the house. Rather than treating those inconsistencies as the kind of imprecision anyone might have about the exact minute they dozed off after a stressful night, the detectives are alleged to have treated them as evidence of deception. Then, on October 27, 2004, Will County authorities announced an arrest. It was Kevin Fox. Riley's own father was accused of raping and murdering his 3-year-old daughter. The Will County State's Attorney's Office announced they intended to seek the death penalty. How did investigators arrive there? The answer lies in what happened during a marathon interrogation just before the arrest, a session that would later become the center of a landmark civil rights lawsuit. According to Kevin Fox and his attorneys, he was brought in for what he believed would be another round of routine questioning. Instead, it stretched on for roughly 14 to 16 hours. Kevin would later say that detectives yelled at him, that they told him things about the case that weren't true, that they threatened him, including, he claimed, a threat that Melissa could lose custody of Tyler if he didn't cooperate. The detectives involved have denied coercing him or threatening him. What's not in dispute is the outcome. By the end of that night, exhausted and, as he would later describe it, believing he had no other way out of the room, Kevin Fox signed a confession admitting to killing his daughter. He recanted almost immediately, telling anyone who would listen that he had not hurt Riley, that he loved her, and that he had only said what he said because he could no longer think straight after hours of pressure in a small room. To anyone familiar with the research on false confessions, the shape of what happened to Kevin Fox is depressingly familiar. Long interrogations, sleep deprivation, investigators who are already convinced of guilt before the questioning begins, and who interpret every answer cooperative or defensive, calm or emotional as further proof of that guilt. Promises, real or implied, that things will go easier if the person just admits what everyone already knows happened. It's a pattern that has surfaced again and again in wrongful conviction cases across the country, and it's a pattern the Fox case would come to exemplify. But it didn't matter. The confession was enough. Kevin Fox was charged with first-degree murder. He was facing the possibility of execution for a crime his family and, eventually, the physical evidence would show he did not commit. Melissa Fox has since described that period of her life in stark terms. In an instant, everything she knew was gone. Her husband was in jail. Her daughter was dead, and now the town that had spent a full night searching for Riley alongside her was being told that the killer had been living in the house the whole time. Kevin Fox spent 8 months in the Will County Jail. The Foxes eventually turned to attorney Kathleen Zellner, who had built a career and would go on to build an even bigger one around overturning wrongful convictions using DNA evidence. Zellner didn't believe the physical evidence matched the confession. There was DNA recovered from the case, including saliva evidence that had originally been labeled inconclusive by the state's testing. Zellner pushed for it to be retested using more advanced techniques than had been available or applied the first time. She won a court order for new testing. The results were unambiguous. The DNA did not belong to Kevin Fox. Someone else, a person never previously connected to the family, had left biological evidence at the scene of Riley's assault and murder. In May 2005, after 8 months behind bars and a looming death penalty case, Kevin Fox was released. The charges against him were ultimately dropped. He was innocent. It wasn't a technicality, and it wasn't a matter of reasonable doubt. The science said directly that another person had committed this crime. Being cleared didn't undo what had happened. Kevin Fox had lost 8 months of his children's lives. He had been publicly branded in his own hometown as the man who murdered his own little girl. Neighbors who had once helped search for Riley now had to reconcile what they'd been told with what turned out to be true. The Foxes sued Will County officials for wrongful arrest, alleging that detectives had fabricated the case against Kevin and coerced his confession. In 2008, a federal jury awarded the family a substantial settlement, more than $15 million. On appeal, that amount was later reduced, ultimately landing around $8 million, but the underlying jury findings stood. The family had been wronged by the investigation itself. But money was never really the point, and both Kevin and Melissa said so publicly, more than once. The point was clearing Kevin's name. Zellner and the Foxes had also refused earlier settlement offers specifically because accepting them would have required Kevin to give up the right to pursue the case in open court, to have a jury hear, in detail, exactly what had been done to him. That mattered more to them than a faster payout. The federal case became a significant one in the broader legal conversation about coerced confessions and police accountability, cited in years afterward as an example of a jury willing to hold individual detectives, not just a department in the abstract, financially responsible for building a case around a confession rather than around evidence. And beneath that, an even more painful truth remained. If Kevin didn't kill Riley, then whoever did was still out there. Still free. Still living, quite possibly, in or near the same small town where he had taken her. With Kevin exonerated, Will County's original theory of the case collapsed, and so, in the eyes of the family and much of the public, did confidence in the department's ability to solve it. The case went cold for years, revisited periodically by journalists and true crime programs asking the same unanswered question. If not Kevin Fox, then who? Eventually, the FBI became involved in re-examining the case. In 2009, federal agents released a wanted poster tied to the investigation, hoping new attention might shake loose old information. It worked. A tip came in. It pointed investigators toward a man named Scott E. Bemin, someone who had been living less than a mile from the Fox family at the time of Riley's murder. E.B. had no known personal connection to the Foxes. He wasn't a family friend, a neighbor they socialized with, or anyone who had crossed paths with Kevin or Melissa in a way that had drawn suspicion before. But he had an extensive criminal record stretching back to the late 1980s burglary, forgery, and critically, a later conviction for the criminal sexual assault of a family member. At the time investigators caught up with him, he was already back in prison on that unrelated charge, on parole at the time of Riley's death. There was something else, too, a detail that had been sitting in evidence for years without anyone connecting it to Eby. Shoes recovered from the creek where Riley's body was found had his name written inside them. That detail alone raises an uncomfortable question that has followed this case ever since. How does physical evidence naming a specific individual sit unexamined for years, while an innocent father is charged with a capital crime based on a coerced confession? It's one of the reasons the Riley Fox case is still studied today, not just as a murder investigation, but as a cautionary example of what happens when investigators fix on a theory early and build a case toward it, rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. In 2010, confronted by FBI investigators, Scott Eby confessed. He told agents that on the night of Riley's disappearance, he had been out breaking into homes around Wilmington. He said the backdoor lock at the Fox house was already broken and that he simply walked in. He described taking Riley from the home, bringing her to Forsyth Woods, and sexually assaulting her in a bathroom at the park. He told investigators that at some point, a bandana he had been using to cover his face slipped off and that this was, by his own account, the reason he decided to kill her, rather than risk her later identifying him. Riley Fox drowned in Forked Creek, left behind by a man she had never met, taken from a room where she should have been safest. Eby was formally charged in 2010. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no trial, no drawn-out battle over evidence. The physical evidence, the DNA that had cleared Kevin Fox years earlier, the shoes bearing Eby's own name, and Eby's own confession left no real room for dispute. Scott Eby remained in the Menard Correctional Center in downstate Illinois for over a decade. He died there on December 7, 2023, at the age of 52, still serving the life sentence he received for Riley's murder. Kevin and Melissa Fox eventually divorced, though both continued, separately, thus to speak about what had happened to their family. Melissa remained in the area and, years later, spoke publicly about the investigation that had targeted her husband, describing it as a second trauma layered directly on top of losing her daughter. Kevin Fox eventually moved away from Illinois, settling in Arkansas. In March 2023, he was killed in a head-on collision when another vehicle crossed the center line on a two-lane highway. He was struck instantly. His attorney, Kathleen Zellner, who had fought for years to clear his name, said simply that her first reaction to the news was deep sorrow for his family. A man who had already survived one nightmare, gone in an instant, in an entirely unrelated tragedy. In Wilmington, the town built something to remember Riley by a small garden near a playground, close to the house she disappeared from, with a statue honoring her memory. It stands today as a quiet marker in a town that has never fully moved past what happened in June of 2004.